life's job, as I quote this quirky scientist at the beginning of the book, is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide. It's to make these two reservoirs sort of react. The more you learn about the history of Earth and the history of life, you find that at the center of it, there is, for some reason, it's rooted through this thing, CO₂, that I think a lot of people just hear about sort of described in the news as this industrial pollutant that comes out of smokestacks, but we're carbon-based life, but the source of that carbon is CO₂. So it's literally the substrate of all life on Earth. And then it has this other amazing feature that it, for the most part, maintains a habitable world for living things to live in. Cycling through the oceans and atmosphere and through rocks, it maintains a habitable temperature for the planet, except for brief, chaotic times in Earth history that we can get into where when it goes out of control, it can also kill most things on the planet. So
Peter Brannen is a best-selling science journalist writing for The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Scientific American, whose work unearths the deep history of life like few others can. He's the author of The Ends of the World, a haunting journey through Earth's greatest mass extinctions, and the story of carbon dioxide is the story of everything, a genre-defying new book that reveals how a single molecule built life, shaped intelligence, and nearly ended it all, more than a single time. Subscribe, because if life is just a hurricane made of carbon, you're gonna want to know what happens when it spins out of control.
life, rather than being a miracle, is sort of this dissipative process, not unlike hurricanes, where its role is to relieve systems that are far from equilibrium and relieve their frustration. So you have a lot of heat trapped in the upper ocean, and hurricanes are these complex, self-organizing things to relieve the planet of that frustration and relieve the heat from the upper ocean and spread it around the planet. Life was just this other process available to planets in general to relieve chemical frustration at the bottom of the ocean at the Hadean when things were really kind of far from equilibrium. But instead of going through heat or water vapor like hurricanes do, their medium is carbon and CO₂, crucially. So that sort of was mind-blowing for me, thinking of life as a channel of energy dissipation, that it just happens to go through carbon chemistry rather than other sorts of ones that are available to complex systems. So
Peter Brannen, why is the story of carbon dioxide the story of everything?
Well, so yeah, it's a grand claim in the title of my book, which I try to justify over the course of a few hundred pages. But I think it actually is justifiable, at least locally on Earth. The more you learn about the history of Earth and the history of life, you find that at the center of it, there is, for some reason, it's rooted through this thing, CO₂, that I think a lot of people just hear about sort of described in the news as this industrial pollutant that comes out of smokestacks. But in the geosciences, there's sort of this much broader context for it where it kind of has a couple amazing features. One of which is that you might have heard that we're carbon-based life, but the source of that carbon is CO₂. So it's literally the substrate of all life on Earth. And then it has this other amazing feature that it, for the most part, maintains a habitable world for living things to live in through its cycling through the oceans and atmosphere and through rocks. It maintains a habitable temperature for the planet. Except for brief, chaotic times in Earth history that we can get into where when it goes out of control, it can also kill most things on the planet. So I think I wanted to step back from the headlines and reintroduce this thing that people had heard about as cosmically important to this planet.
Yeah. What do you think most people get wrong about carbon dioxide? You mentioned there that most average listeners' exposure to that gas is probably some alarmist CNN segment where they're talking about how it's, going to cause global warming. It's going to cause all of these issues in the world. But what do people most get wrong about it?
I think it's sort of hearing about it in that context and thinking about it. We had CFCs that destroyed the ozone layer or diminished it. And then we made some regulations and that's healed a little bit. And we've had, you have methyl mercury emissions. And this is just another one of those sort of environmental pollutants. And it really, I think you can't really appreciate how radical sort of the experiment running on the planet is today unless you sort of appreciate this thing's fundamental role and how it works. So I think the reason why it's concerning what we're doing on the planet today is because this stuff is so important to how the planet normally operates, and it's, it makes the planet Earth, I argue, the way it behaves on this planet. So we can get into that, but I think that's sort of the misunderstood thing, that this is not just another, industrial byproduct. This really is at the center of the story of life on Earth.
Right. Yeah, let's go to the very start of that story. What was the role in carbon dioxide in the origin of life? Paint that picture first. Like, where are we? What does the world look like? And
Yeah.
what is carbon dioxide doing exactly?
Yeah. So life probably started around 4 billion years ago. There's the oldest fossils are, I think like 3.8, 3.6 to 3.8, but it probably started before then, in the Hadean eon. The Hadean is so long ago that there's basically no rocks left over at all from the Hadean eon. The planet has been reworked by tectonics and just 4 billion years of planetary evolution since then, that basically there's no fossil record at all of life in the Hadean. So we sort of have to make these um, inferences about what it was like. There actually is one, like there's a rock in Canada, the Acasta Gneiss, that actually is from it, which is kind of mind blowing, but that's a separate story. But yeah, it was, I think our understanding of it is sort of coming into focus better. Some very clever geochemistry and planetary science has sort of painted this picture of what life was like in the Hadean, and it was a really noxious, horrible time for the planet. So it was probably a water world. The oceans were probably twice as deep. The surface of the planet was just getting bombarded by UV radiation and asteroid impacts. And there's no ozone layer. There would have just been hurricanes racing around the surface of the planet nonstop. And so this probably is not a very conducive place to start life on Earth on the surface. So I write about in the book, and I know you've talked to Nick Lane before, there's sort of emerging, and I would say, it's the most exciting frontier in origin of life research, is these amazing hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean that they're probably not like the ones that your listeners are familiar with, the really hot, violent, smoking ones. They're sort of gentler ones that have a little different chemistry, called alkaline hydrothermal vents, but they are perfect, almost bizarrely perfect for catalyzing reactions that are at the absolute heart of all metabolism for all life on Earth today. Whether you're a bacteria, you're an elephant, these things are capable of making these carbon compounds that basically all metabolism goes through. And yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally, how does this fit into CO2? It's fundamentally a story about CO2. So
getting accurate and unbiased information from the latest scientific research is critical for my job as a science communicator. That's why for over 1 year now, I have been doing all of my scientific research with Consensus.ai. You can think of Consensus as the ChatGPT for science, trained exclusively on research papers, so it doesn't give you that hallucinated garbage like ChatGPT. Recently, I've been in love with the new deep search function they just launched. Let's try it out. So I needed to learn about brain organoids for a podcast with Philip Ball. Let's run a deep search and see how Consensus helps me understand the entire breadth of a field in literally the shortest time possible. It filters through every paper on brain organoids, giving a really nice intro summary at the top. It comes up with this really interesting question: do brain organoids model human brain development accurately? And gives me a consensus bar on the evidence. It tells you the top contributors in different fields. This is a table I love: claims and evidence. It lists out the most relevant claims to your original search and ranks them by evidence. I mean, seriously, where was this while I was in college? I think that's about 20 hours of work right there in one button click. If you're a scientific researcher, a student in college, or you're simply curious and have questions about science, then I think Consensus AI is a complete no-brainer. And the best news is that you can use my link in the description to get a whole month completely free, so there's really no reason at all not to try it out, and it really supports the channel. Thank you so much.
In the book, I sort of describe, and this is me absorbing a lot of literature from other origin of life researchers, but you sort of come across this incredible, and for me, totally reframed how I thought about life on Earth, way of thinking about it, which is that where I think I was sort of familiar with the idea that life was, maybe you had some weird molecule, this chance miracle that happened somewhere on the planet that started replicating, and it really was a one-off kind of miracle, I guess, of chemistry that somehow made this, some sort of RNA looking thing. And this is a totally different explanation where it isn't contingent at all. It's actually life, rather than being a miracle, is sort of this natural, this dissipative process, not unlike hurricanes, where its role is to relieve systems that are far from equilibrium and relieve their frustration. So that sounds kind of abstract, but the analogy is to hurricanes, where you have a lot of heat trapped in the upper ocean, and hurricanes are these complex, self-organizing things that just, organize all on their own to relieve the planet of that frustration and relieve the heat from the upper ocean and spread it around the planet and most of it back into space, re-radiate back into space, and sort of relieve the planet of this source of frustration. And life was just this other process available to planets in general to relieve chemical frustration at the bottom of the ocean at the Hadean when things were really kind of far from equilibrium. But instead of going through heat or water vapor like hurricanes do, their medium is carbon and CO₂, crucially. So I guess that sort of was mind-blowing for me, thinking of life as a channel of energy dissipation, that it just happens to go through carbon chemistry rather than other sorts of ones that are available to complex systems. So yeah, that's the general story. Oh, and I guess the CO₂ story is that, and then you really get into some wonky geochemistry where in the early Earth, CO₂ would have been way higher, which is a good thing because the sun was a lot dimmer, so we didn't freeze over. But this would have meant that the oceans were just suffused with CO₂, which makes them more acidic. And so the chemistry of the ocean is a lot different. And the chemistry of the seafloor is a lot different in that the plate tectonics was still sort of sorting itself out. And you had this like really far from equilibrium chemistry where the oceans were meeting the seafloor. And they would have been really frustrated because you would have just had all these reactions generating all this free hydrogen and all this carbon dioxide everywhere. And life's job, as I quote this quirky scientist at the beginning of the book, is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide. It's to make these two reservoirs sort of react. The problem is it's not a reaction that kind of wants to happen on its own. And life was there to sort of help it along, I guess, in the chemistry of these vents that bizarrely resemble the electrochemistry of like your cells today in a way that's really eerie almost.
Right. So the model that I have in my head, and you can tell me where this goes wrong, is that at some point it was 100% geochemistry. So just the chemistry of the earth. And then kind of due to, as you say, dissipative processes and more stable energy configurations, it gets a little bit of biochemistry in that geochemistry system. But the biochemistry is really only stable because of the geochemical environment that it's in. So then it's, goes from 100% to a little bit of biochemistry happening. That's a stable local packet of biochemistry. And then maybe that gets dissipated and goes back to geochemistry. Then maybe it goes back to, and maybe that happens many, many times over tens of millions of years. But eventually that amount of biochemistry in the system gets greater and greater, and it gets less reliant on the geochemistry, and sort of is almost substituting parts of geochemistry for local biochemistry. And then over enough time of this happening, you get this like local membrane, which is capable of biochemistry and is not so dependent on the geochemistry around. Do you think that's somewhat the puzzle that fits in your mind?
Yeah, and as you can tell, there's probably a lot of like yada 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 between one, the geochemistry and then getting life itself. And there's still sort of vast gaps in our understanding of how that transition might have happened, but there's at least sort of a plausible roadmap. But yeah, I mean, given that life started on a planet without life, you need to go to a non-living system to figure out where the most plausible place it might have started. And what's kind of amazing is that this guy, Mike Russell, at the time I interviewed him, he was the origin of life researcher at NASA JPL. But he had predicted, he had sort of said, given that life started from a non-living world, he predicted there should be this kind of vent somewhere on the planet, and we haven't found it yet. And so he actually predicted that this specific kind of vent, an alkaline hydrothermal vent, should exist. And then sure enough, a few years later, scientists at the University of Washington went down to the bottom of the ocean and found exactly the thing matching his description. So, people keep going back to these vents and sampling them, like someone who I interview in the book, trying to tease out what they're making abiotically. And yeah, they're making these very important metabolites. But yeah, how does it actually become life, the amazing thing about life is that, it's not like a hurricane or like a hydrothermal event. Like there really is something different. And the sort of traditional story about, sometimes these camps are described as information first versus metabolism first. And I'm sort of describing the metabolism first. The information first theory of life is the one that I think most people are familiar with, sort of the RNA world, where you get a weird replicating molecule and then it kind of
Right.
bootstraps the rest of life after that. But I think something I emphasize in my book is just how shockingly energetic life is, and that it's very hard, at least in my mind, to figure out how um, a replicating information molecule bootstraps this like rocket engine of energy to power itself afterwards. And sort of if you flip that, the other possible explanation is that it was the rocket engine that came first. Then life is sort of this control system, or like the genetics and things were sort of this control system for keeping life, not just a random geological process, but keeping it confined. And then natural selection can act on it if it starts replicating, and then you're kind of off to the races. But yeah, we're talking about this all very high level, and there's obviously there's a ocean of ignorance about how we actually get from one to the other.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating field. I even just saw, I think like 3 days ago or so, they found a new 45 base pair RNA strand that was capable of perfect replication. So I think it's like
Yeah.
the smallest possible segment that they've ever found that is on itself autocatalytic and capable of making copies of itself. Have you seen this?
I just saw a headline, but I didn't dive
Yeah.
in too deep. But yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I came away from this book writing process in general feeling was just complete kind of cosmic awe and gratitude that the living systems that keep us alive, these sort of this nanomachinery of the cell, that it doesn't fall apart after 2 seconds because it's so complex and intricate. It's just kind of mind blowing. That even something like the high school biology I learned about mitochondria and electron transport chains and all these sort of boring things that I had trouble keeping my eyes open in high school when I learned about them. Now revisiting them as an adult and really grappling with how amazing it is that we have this electricity coursing through us to pump protons to one side of a membrane and then letting them back down to turn a turbine to make ATP, which is like one of the most simple things your your cells do, is just like science fiction nanotechnology. So
Yeah, it's spectacular. I never get tired of it. Yeah, I
yeah,
love my job because I just get to spend all the time talking about and learning about these kinds of ideas. I really
yeah,
think that, most science fiction writers, if they just learned about biology, would be more
right,
shocked by what's real than the widest imagination for what
right,
happens in the biological system. Especially
definitely,
now, what we're seeing with like modern biology, which is like agency and cognition at every level of organization, where like
mm,
cells seem to be doing these complex behaviors. They seem to be learning. They seem to be doing memory. It's not just like you get DNA. DNA is read out and it's kind of just factories. Like
right,
proteins are machines. Like there's a lot more agency. Some people will say free will. Some people will say consciousness, whatever, at every level
yeah,
of organization. But it's definitely a lot fuzzier. It's a lot more interesting than, the say 1980s up until now idea of like DNA is just making little machines that are proteins and then it builds the rest of the organism. Like modern biology is just infinitely more fascinating than that.
yeah. No, that is fascinating, and it's uh, for me it was it I'm used to writing about things at a planetary scale and over millions of years. So that was sort of dipping my toe back into this world of biological nanomachinery was a real trip, and hopefully I can do more of that in the future.
How much have you thought about life on other planets? With how constrained, if we think about that origin of life story again, with how constrained that environmental scenario is, as you say, we have carbon dioxide, we have alkaline hydrothermal deep sea vents that are creating like the perfect sort of pocket of chemicals for life. How do you think about that on other planets?
Yeah. So I mean, I grew up as kind of a space nerd who would dream about, oh my God, what's under the ice in Europa? Are there squid and things like that? And we we got to get out there and visit other worlds. And the the past like 10 to 15 years or so of just really diving into what made this place Earth has made me realize that I'm sure there's people out there to talk to, but they're too far away that we're never going to ever make contact, because the contingent, incredible events that led to our being here and having this conversation, um, from everything from the fact that we have this really bizarrely large moon that stabilizes our axis, like just a mundane thing like the size of the moon. And then you learn about tectonics, if the ratio of magnesium and silicon, like these very boring geochemical facts about the makeup of this planet. If they're slightly different, plate tectonics probably wouldn't have gotten going, and so you wouldn't have had this sort of planetary regulation that allowed life to thrive. So I think I'm of two minds. That I think getting to intelligent life is probably very, very difficult. But learning sort of the story about the origin of life made me think that life is probably a pretty general phenomenon, because it's not that hard to get. CO₂ and hydrogen are not very rare in the world, and there might even be these kind of vents might be like in Enceladus. I don't think they're in Europa. I think we've recently discovered that there's not much going on even on the seafloor in Europa. I don't know how they just figure that out. I'm not.
Yeah.
But so I think that this sort of basic dissipative structure sort of story of life that could happen pretty generally around the universe. But all of there's also this eerie fact that life started about 4 billion years ago, and complex multicellular life doesn't really start until 580 million years ago. So there's a 3.5 billion year kind of gap between where the only most interesting thing the planet's making is sort of microbial muck. And then a lot of things have to happen on the planet in order to finally get to the point where you have life as energetic and complex as complex life. And then even once animal life gets off the ground, we don't show up until the very end of that story. And there's all sorts of contingent reasons for that too. Like in the book, I make this argument that the ice ages probably had a lot to do with our developing language and technology and culture and all these things that sort of make us human. And maybe you learn about the Mesozoic and the age of dinosaurs. It really was kind of just warm to very warm, and so maybe the dinosaurs never really had a chance to develop intelligent, like human level intelligence, or maybe they did and they wiped themselves out. They were asteroid mining and they screwed up at the end. The geological record's fuzzy enough that we wouldn't really know.
Right. I've asked a couple of different guests if they think life on other planets will be anything like Earth. And I remember Nick Lane sort of thinks that there's good reason life is the way it is. And that if you had roughly the same atmosphere and similar enough conditions, you might get something roughly similar to how life started on Earth on other planets, if the atmosphere and the conditions are roughly the same. And then I asked Lee Cronin, he was like, that's a pile of shit. So like very divided on this, where people have said, no, there's good reason life is the way it is. Like it's very stable under these sets of environmental conditions. And some people are like, no, that's ridiculous. You're taking your one Earth-based example and you're extrapolating without any, you can't really do that. Where would you fall down on that debate, do you think?
I think I would be closer to Nick Lane's side of the story. And I mean, before this book, I sort of hadn't dipped my toes in the really ancient Earth. I mostly wrote about the age of animal life and the climate and tectonics of the age of animal life. And there's long been this story or this question of, if you ran back the tape of life, would you get the same sort of creatures on the planet today? And you do have convergent evolution is obviously a major feature of the fossil record, where it's kind of shocking that ichthyosaurs, a reptile, and dolphins basically are indistinguishable. And it's because there are optimal solutions to the question how to swim fast that life
Right.
converges on. And I think a lot of sort of questions of biology might have those sort of convergent optimal paths, which isn't to say sometimes you don't get weird experiments. Like you do get like plesiosaurs with 4 independent paddles. Those are totally weird and they have long necks. But for the most part, life is constrained by it's a reflection kind of the environment. And so as long as the environment's pretty similar, then it will converge on similar solutions to how to get around and make its way in the world.
Right. let's move ahead to the first mass extinction, which kind of surprisingly is not for a very, very long time after life is on Earth. So like maybe that's the first interesting question is like why did it take you have life for, you know, probably about 3.7 billion years or so before the
Mhm.
first mass extinction? Does that mean that the Earth was in a relatively stable state in that time? Or like what's the explanation for that?
Well, I mean, so some people will point to there's this thing, the Great Oxygenation Event, 2.5 billion years ago, that some people will say, "Oh, this was the first mass extinction because you had all these anoxic microbes that suddenly there was oxygen in the air, and so there's this huge mass extinction." But that is more of a pop science story than it actually validated by our sort of understanding of Earth history, because uh, nothing went extinct during that extinction. Maybe for a couple reasons. Oxygen probably only topped out at like 1% of the atmosphere during the Great Oxygenation Event. So it's sort of overrated in the, at least the way it's talked about sometimes. And so
Right.
that meant large, vast expanses of the ocean stayed anoxic, which meant they were perfectly happy and they made it through. And even today, anoxic microbes are a huge part of recycling elements and stuff on the planet. So if you ever hear someone say, "Oh, the first mass extinction was a great oxygenation event," you can you don't have to listen to that. There's there's a couple of planetary cataclysms that happened before the rise of animal life. There's two snowball Earths, um, where the planet freezes to the tropics, the oceans freeze to the tropics, and it really is kind of if you're an alien surveying planets, I think you just go over Earth, you'd be like, that's Hoth basically. It's just the snowball planet. Um,
What time period is this?
Yeah, so there's one around this time of the Great Oxygenation Event, 2.5 billion years ago. But then the most recent one, in quotes, is starts 714 million years ago, and it doesn't totally thaw until 635 million years ago. So it is a long period where the planet is frozen solid. There's briefly a thaw for 15 million years in that stretch, and then the thaw out of that snowball Earth around 635 million years ago is also one of the craziest climate events in Earth history, where you almost flip geologically overnight into this ultra super greenhouse where the thing melts in a matter of millennia, and sea level goes up by a kilometer and it gets super hot. And the bizarre thing about that is, in its wake, where for 4 billion years, as I said, the most interesting thing on the planet was sort of pond muck. In the wake of the second snowball Earth, it's not that long after that animal life sort of explodes. So there's this open research question: what is the connection between this massive climate catastrophe and finally the champagne cork of animal life going off after that?
Right.
But then, yeah, like the age of mass extinctions, I would say, doesn't really start until you have complex life, animal life, because as you can imagine, it would be really hard to wipe out like a bacteria or microbes. Like a lot of them are like incredible generalists. They can exist in all environments and they're unbelievably numerate. So it's just very hard to wipe out like bacteria or simple eukaryotes, which is what existed for all of Earth history. And then once you have animal life, which has higher energy needs more resources, and is more specialized, has to live in certain environments, then you can have these big mass extinctions where and the environment changes fast enough that it exceeds the adaptive capacity of animal life, because we are not as adaptable as bacteria. We're a little more finicky. We need the temperature to be in a certain range, and we can only migrate so far in our lives or reproduce so many times in our lives. So we're more vulnerable. We're more energetic and arguably more interesting than microbes, but we're also more vulnerable when the global environment changes rapidly. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the first mass extinction proper is this thing called the Endor-Division mass extinction 445 million years ago, where the planet seems to go into an ice age and then rebound out of it. And but in the book, I really talk about the extinction that I hone in on is this thing, the end Permian mass extinction 252 million years ago, which is, we can get into it, but it's the biggest mass extinction of all time by far. It strikes a planet that has a thriving ecosystem on land of animals and plants and things, and beautiful sponge reefs and trilobites and sea scorpions. It's sort of an unfamiliar world because I think most people when you're in a natural history museum, there's a lot of weird animals in the Permian. I think people kind of walk through the rooms with the weird Permian animals to get to the big dinosaur exhibits, but there are all these bizarre, things that look like dinosaurs that are actually closely related to us. But I talk about it in the book because it's caused by like just the most extreme emissions of CO2 imaginable from these volcanoes, and it provides sort of a lesson for, if we kept doing our experiment of injecting tons and tons and tons of CO2 into the atmosphere for, hundreds to thousands of years, this shows you where that path leads. And it obviously gets very dark because it's the biggest mass extinction ever.
Right. Yeah. Paint this step by step with carbon dioxide as the key figure. Like when a planet goes from freezing to warm all the way through to the North and South Pole, like how does carbon dioxide fluctuate? And like what are the key chemical reactions that are actually happening there?
Yeah. So I think earlier I described how, carbon dioxide has maintained a habitable temperature for life on Earth, for the most part, over the age of animals. And so how this works is the Earth has this kind of incredible built-in thermostat. So it's a good thing that there's some CO2 in the air. Right now, we're sort of seeing what happens when you put way too much up in the air way too fast. But it's a good thing there's some of this stuff in the air. Because, for instance, if you took all the CO2 out of the atmosphere tomorrow, the temperature would drop by something like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, I'm always switching between the two, and I'm not good at the conversions. But
I'll convert on screen.
Okay.
Don't worry.
All right. In a half century, and you'd go into a snowball Earth within, like a half century. Or, well, you wouldn't fully go into a snowball Earth by then, but you'd be on your way to a snowball Earth if you took the CO2 out of the air. You'd also kill all life on Earth because photosynthesis would end. There'd be no carbon for carbon-based life, but that's another story. So it's a good thing that there's some CO2 in the air to keep the planet from freezing over. And it's normally supplied by volcanoes, which erupt at 1/100th of the rate that we're emitting it into the atmosphere today. So there's a steady trickle of CO2 from volcanoes all over the Earth, at mid-ocean ridges and in big volcanoes on land, but it's being put into the air, and that's okay. And it doesn't build up and fry the place because you also have these other planetary processes that are removing it at the same rate. And the most important one, which, geologists need to be better at marketing, because I think it's this amazing feature of the planet that it has this thermostat that regulates its temperature, but it's called the silicate carbonate weathering cycle. So that's just deadly. People's eyes glaze over. Yeah. But the way it works is that, so the CO2 comes out of volcanoes and it reacts with rainwater, and that chemically and physically breaks down rocks. And the products of that reaction wash into rivers and then out into the ocean. And things like phytoplankton that make shells out of calcium carbonate, make chalk basically, or oysters or coral reefs precipitate that calcium carbonate to make their shells and eventually become limestone. And so what was once CO2 in the atmosphere becomes limestone and is like commended to the fossil record basically. And that might sound like not a very good sink, but if you go to the White Cliffs of Dover, that's just chalk from microscopic phytoplankton that was once algae in the ocean. So it really builds up over time. And the reason why this is a thermostat and why it's amazing is that if for some reason volcanoes get out of control and CO2 goes up too high, it makes it warmer, which actually speeds up. It makes the world stormier and wetter and hotter, which speeds up these rock weathering reactions, which then make the planet better at sequestering CO2 elsewhere. So the planet cools off if it threatens to go out of control.
Right.
And conversely, if for some reason the volcanoes start putting out less, and it starts cooling off, it slows down all these weathering reactions. So more CO2 stays in the air and it stays warm. So this is a really narrow window the planet has to navigate. When CO2, kind of amazing thing is how little CO2 there is in the atmosphere. We're worried about it being 420 parts per million today, which there's good reason to be worried about that. It hasn't been that high in 3 million years when sea level was a lot higher. But 420 parts per million is like unbelievably diffuse. It's the same as saying there's 0.04% of the atmosphere's CO2. And when CO2 has gone between 0.1% of the atmosphere and 0.02% of the atmosphere, that's been the difference of a world with crocodiles and palm trees at the Arctic Circle in 0.0 and 0.1. And then 0.02 is Antarctica's worth of ice on North America, and sea level's 400 feet lower. And there's woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and all that cool stuff. So it's a super narrow window that it maintains through this incredible thermostat, but the thermostat can break. And in Snowball Earth and in this thing at the end Permian mass extinction, it breaks in different directions. Once it goes really cold, but in the Permian, the reason why it breaks is that you can imagine weathering all the rocks on the planet is a very slow process, and so it keeps the planet habitable over hundreds of thousands of years. But if you suddenly inject so much CO2 so fast into the air that these long-term geological sinks for it can't compensate for how much is going to the air, it just uncontrollably heats up the planet and does all their nasty stuff, like reacts with the seawater and makes it more acidic. So you get ocean acidification, which is bad for these things that calcify. And when it's warmer, the ocean loses oxygen. So there's all these sort of runaway. The system can bend, and it can sort of take. CO2 can go up and go down, and sort of things stay in equilibrium. But then you can reach this like escape failure mode, where the planet just can't do anything about it and just gets way too hot. And in the end Permian mass extinction, 252 million years ago, this huge swath of Russia, of Siberia, basically turns inside out. You just have these burbling volcanoes for tens of thousands of years. And they would have been coming up through one of the largest coal basins on Earth. And so they would have just been burning through tons and tons of fossil fuels and putting tens of thousands of gigatons of CO2 into the air over thousands of years. And clever geochemists looking at the rock see that the temperature goes up by something like 10 degrees C over 15 to 30,000 years. The oceans acidify, they lose their oxygen.
Wow. That's crazy, right? Is that the fastest or the biggest delta in temperature that we can track in any history?
That I would think 10 degrees C. I mean, some estimates are even higher. It's like 10 to 16 degrees C. So potentially even warmer than that. And yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything comparable. You have estimates for some of the other mass extinctions that are similar, but the Permian seems like the biggest. And I mean, the aftermath is much grislier than any of the other mass extinctions, where it takes 10 million years for the planet to kind of recover fully. And the oceans have very little oxygen in them for millions of years afterwards. So yeah, it's this gruesome event. I mean, this is sort of irrelevant to the CO2, but I feel like it's worth just pointing out because it's so mind-blowing, is these volcanoes I'm talking about are really nothing we have any evolutionary history with. They are so mind-blowing where, we talk about Yellowstone today, but if it went off, it would be this devastating thing, which it would be. It would cover, it'd be bad for agriculture, and it would cover a few U.S. states and a few inches of ash, which would be devastating. But the Siberian traps, which are these volcanoes I'm talking about, erupted enough lava and intruded enough magma that it could cover the lower 48 United States a kilometer deep in lava. So these are just
holy shit.
Yeah. So but lava, as spectacular as that is in Russia, doesn't explain why things on the bottom of the ocean on the other side of the world are going extinct. And so it really is the gases that are coming out of the volcanoes, and CO2 is the big one.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work.
BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Yeah, it's kind of miraculous. I was reading the numbers of, the percentage of marine and land species that went extinct in each of these different extinction events. I mean, the numbers I have for end Permian is 96% of all marine species went extinct, 70% of all land species. I mean, when you lose that much of an ecosystem, it's sort of a miracle that anything survives, because you think of the ecosystem as all being in balance with each other. They're all balanced predator-prey relationships. Do we know what kind of species survived these things, and what were the traits and characteristics of their behavior that allowed them to be the 4% of marine species that survived, the 30% of land? What separated them?
You see sort of generalist weedy species in the wake of the mass extinction. So today you can go to one tide pool and then go, 20 miles away and go to a different tide pool, and you'll see a completely different suite of, creatures that are living in both of them. In the wake of the end Permian mass extinction, no matter where you look, anywhere on the planet, you find this one kind of very simple clam that kind of just takes over the planet. And in the sort of vertebrate land creature world, you see this little pig-like thing, Lysosaurus, which somehow makes it through, which people have come up with all sorts of explanations for what its morphology and physiology might have been that helped it get through. It's sort of this barrel-chested little pig-like thing that might have burrowed, and so things generally get simpler and just everywhere. In the same way that, if you, I don't know, if you just bomb a rainforest, the things that will follow in its wake will be sort of very fast reproducing weedy ferns and things like that. And it takes a very long time to rebuild the biodiversity that you once had. So where in the previously you had these sort of resplendent reefs all over the planet, it takes tens of millions of years for anything like a complex reef ecosystem to emerge again. Because you can imagine a lot of those are very intricate, specialized sort of relationships between different organisms that make something as complex as a reef. And so that it does take a long time to rebuild the biodiversity. And, if you're going to be grim about it, that will be our longest legacy if we don't get our act together as a species, where if we just completely put, our pedal to the metal fossil fuels for the next few centuries, or we wipe ourselves out for some reason, there will be this if you're a geologist hundreds of millions of years from now, going through some canyon in the future, and you see the human layer, if in that scenario, it would just be this weird little line of, maybe shale and a big thing of limestone. And you'd be like, that's weird. But you will notice that for tens of millions of years afterwards, the legacy on the fossil record. So even if we're not around, we potentially will leave this massive legacy going forward tens of millions of years in the future. So hopefully we don't do that though.
Yeah, well, I think I want to touch on that at the end, sort of how the big lesson to be learned from these different mass extinctions. But if we stick with the end Permian, so there's gigantic volcanoes that are probably orders of magnitude larger than any volcano that exists today, shooting an inordinate amount of lava and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The climate warms. How does it ever get back into a state for life again? How many millions of years? What needs to happen for life to be regenerated from the 4% of marine species that are left and just the 30% of land? Hey, what needs to happen in the environment and evolution to get life flourishing again?
Yeah. Well, I guess I could dive a little more into the grisly details of how it actually is that everything falls apart.
Definitely.
Before we rebuild it all. So the CO2, like you get tons of CO2, it makes it a lot warmer.
Hey, did you ever get sad learning about this, by the way, or are you just a bit far removed from it? Like the numbers are so large that like you shouldn't just read 96% of marine species died and then just not have any effect. You know what I mean? Like it feels very detached from those numbers, but it's also very tragically sad at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like you know, there should be some national monument to like, you know, the victims of the Permian. Here's a big, you know, go and lay some flowers by it. But it is sad we lost the world. But in some ways, it like we wouldn't be around if the Permian never happened. Like it is kind of amazing in the wake of it. Within 20 million years, all these modern lineages show up. So, you know, 20 million years after the Permian, the world finally picks up the pieces, and you get the first true mammals, the first true dinosaurs, which is weird to call them modern, but like we have birds today. First modern conifers, modern stony coral reefs, they all show up kind of in the wake of this. So the new world that we live in was sort of born in the ashes of this. And it might be that some of the things that went extinct, the reason why our world looks the way it does is because things were selected for. So you have these like really like low energy, these things called brachiopods, which this is probably too wonky to even get into, but like bivalves and brachiopods look very similar, even though they're not really closely related. They're these things in shells. And brachiopods are just this very archaic way of making a living. They're extremely low energy. They are not very adaptable. And afterwards, they just take a hit and they're gone. They're not gone. They're amazingly, they still live today, but they're basically ecologically unimportant. So it could be that like parts of our world were even selected for by this extinction. So while it is sad that we lost the world with Paleozoic, you know, it had a good run. It was time for something new. But
it is
yeah,
it's an interesting point though. Like there are probably something alive today, or features of our biology today, or biology that exists today, that is dependent on those 4% marine species, 30% of land species that survived even 250 million years ago.
Yeah. So Peter Ward, actually, this paleontologist, one of the features of this mass extinction is that it gets so hot and so like stormy, so much rock weathering is going on that you get the rocks are weathering and releasing all this phosphorus in the ocean. So you're powering these huge algae blooms that are drawing down oxygen even more. So oxygen goes down so low in the mass extinction that hydrogen sulfide is probably being produced by these really noxious bacteria. And hydrogen sulfide is unbelievably toxic to, you know, complex life at very low parts per million. And so this might have been one of the major kill mechanisms of the mass extinction was hydrogen sulfide just suffusing the ocean and probably wafting into the air and killing things. But this guy, Peter Ward, this paleontologist, actually has this hypothesis that, you know, if you're trying to put someone into surgery, and I don't know where the research is on this now, but like if you give someone a very little bit of like hydrogen sulfide, it like puts them into sort of like a like suspended animation sort of state where, and he thinks maybe this is an adaptation to this mass extinction, that animals that had this like reflex of basically like shutting down, like slowing their metabolism a lot in the presence of this really noxious gas might have been selected for by this mass extinction. So we might still have this kind of legacy within us that is from this event. So that's interesting.
So cool to think about. It's such a weird thought. I'd love to know if that's possible to prove in any way. Could you? I guess you could do genealogical analysis and track back to see if there's any overlaps. Or like, how would you prove that?
Yeah, I guess you would have to do like a molecular clock thing to find out where that trait actually comes from. But again, this is outside of my wheelhouse. I heard him say that in a talk a few years ago. I don't know if there's been any research on it since, but it was just a cool kind of idea. But yeah, you asked, how does the world actually recover? And it's through things like rock weathering. Eventually, things get back in equilibrium. So all the CO2 we're putting in the air today eventually is going to come out of the system as things like limestone and coal and oil and things. The problem is that just the timescale is too long to be relevant to human lives, and it was too long to be relevant to the lives of things in the Permian too. But eventually, the planet cools off because it has ways of scrubbing CO2 out of the system and cooling things off. It just takes a long time. The other thing about this mass extinction is that the world was very different. So sometimes I'm not sure whether to get spooked by the end Permian, because it is sort of the same levers we're pulling on the planet today, or to just sort of say, it was so long ago and the world was so much different than ours that maybe there isn't that much relevant. So for instance, this is during the age of Pangea, which people might be familiar with as this like supercontinent where all the continents were brought together. And there's reasons to think that actually made the planet worse at scrubbing CO2 out of its system. And the very simple reason is that if you have a huge supercontinent, the middle of it is just an arid interior. It was a vicious, horrible place in the middle of Pangea, and it's getting very little weather. So the rocks are not weathering there. So it's actually worse at getting rid of CO2. The other thing that's encouraging is in the wake of this mass extinction, calcifying phytoplankton, the stuff I was describing before, like what the White Cliffs of Dover are made out of, all this algae that builds its shell out of calcium carbonate, had not yet evolved until it wasn't until the Triassic, after the Permian. So the planet was missing this huge kind of safety valve of carbon burial, and ultimately this carpet of limestone at the bottom of the ocean that we take for granted today, that didn't exist in the Permian, actually would have helped stem the misery in the Permian as well. I realize that I'm jamming in a lot of geochemistry here, but
I like to put graphics and definitions and
Okay.
sort of schematics, so there'll be lots of stuff on the screen so that will help people.
Okay.
I think follow along. No, this is super interesting. Please keep going. Keep geochemistry, and I'm learning a lot.
Yeah, yeah. So in the wake of the Permian, the continents start breaking apart, which is probably good for the planet's ability to regulate itself. It's getting this more vigorous biological carbon pump, and this, as I said, sort of the seafloor start being covered with calcium carbonate, which is, for complicated reasons, is actually good for the planet's ability to regulate its CO2. And you get all these modern life forms evolve. Life seems to get more energetic in the wake of this. So both on land and in the ocean, you sort of get the rise of on land, like warm-bloodedness and higher metabolism animals, and in the ocean you see a similar increase in sort of energy through ecosystems. So a more modern world is born in the wake, and then you get the reign of dinosaurs for like 150 million years, which I kind of skip over in the book, even though that's everyone's favorite part of Earth history. But from my perspective, it's kind of boring, because even though dinosaurs are really cool, the Earth goes from like warm to very warm over a very long time span. And then I pick up the story again in the Age of Mammals, which is, I think, at least a more interesting climate story, where sort of our evolution sort of was fundamentally shaped by a switch from a really high CO2 hot period to a really low CO2 cold period that sort of shaped our evolution.
Talk through I've always been interested in why organisms grew so large in that time period. Like, I know there's a lot of ideas on this. Like, there was nothing close to the size of dinosaurs on land before the dinosaurs, right? There was something
That's
about the
true.
environmental conditions, organisms just like 10x'd in size. Why is that?
That's a great question. You do see in the Age of Mammals, things get really big. So I think we give dinosaurs a lot of credit, but we kind of take for granted how big stuff got in the tens of millions of years after they went extinct. Like, you do get these hornless rhinoceroses, like in Ethereum, which are kind of dinosaur scaled, and some of them, like was it Paleoxodon, some elephant in the Pleistocene, got absolutely gigantic. But you're right, dinosaurs were huge. I'm not the best person to ask on this. I know there's reasons for animal body size. There's a lot of different ideas. One of them is just, so sort of the least satisfying explanation is just that if you leave things around for long enough and they're evolving and speciating, if you are starting at like, there's a floor to how small you can get, you can kind of just like drift bigger and bigger and bigger. There's no cap on that kind of. So it could kind of just be a, sort of a random drift away from baseline. There's fascinating things about, like, the size of continents will actually predict what the size the biggest animal is on the continent.
Interesting.
Because, range sizes can only be so big and on smaller continents, and you can get really, really giant animals need to eat a lot of food from over a huge range. And so if you have a giant continent where ranges aren't overlapping, you get really huge animals. And so I'm not the best person to ask, but I know there's a lot of interesting thinking on maximum body size that I could probably,
Yeah.
yeah.
How do you think carbon dioxide plays into this story? Because again, as the source of, the Lego building blocks for these dinosaurs is still carbon dioxide. I am either creating plants that they're eating as omnivores or just from, breathing in the atmosphere. How does carbon dioxide levels change and vary throughout that period in the atmosphere? And how do we know that as well?
They're higher than a lot higher than modern, and in general there's very little ice on. I mean, for the most part, there's no ice on the planet in the Mesozoic, and occasionally you might get some very small ice sheets here and there. There's all sorts of brilliant ways for reconstructing ancient CO2. So in sort of more recent history, and I put recent in quotes because from my perspective, the last few 100,000 years is pretty recent. But we have ice cores that go back a few million years, and you can literally just have these air bubbles that you can see what the CO2 level is in, going back a few 100,000 years. But then the oldest ice on the planet's only a few million years. So then you have to get more clever about how you reconstruct CO2. And there's all sorts of interesting paleo proxies, like, so one that has been used a lot is like plants have these pores on their leaves called stomata that they take in CO2 through. But the problem with those is that's how they eat. They take it in through these pores on their leaves. But if they have too many of them, they're losing water. And so they don't want to dry out. So they try to minimize the amount of these pores on their leaves. And so when CO2 is super high, they don't need as many because they can sort of take in more through fewer pores. So people have used investigating fossil leaves, and basically there's this ratio of like pores on their leaves to like what CO2 is probably like. There's other,
Cool.
there's other wonkier ones like the boron proxy and, looking at these isotopes and reconstructing it based on like kind of what we understand about seawater chemistry. A cool one I think is that like a lot of our baking soda today, we mine from this rock called nacolite, and nacolite does not form on our planet today. It can only form when CO2 is above like 680 or 700 parts per million or something like that. So if you find this rock and you know the age of it, CO2 is above a certain level. So that's another one. There's all sorts of interesting ways to do this stuff. And in the age of dinosaurs, it was a warm planet. How that affected dinosaur physiology, one thing about being warm-blooded is that if you want to lose heat, like if you want to not basically cook and just like die of hyperthermia, a strategy to beating the heat is actually being really hot so you can dissipate your heat into the environment because it's cooler than you. And so there is this interesting feature of like bird physiology where they run hotter than mammals. And it might be because they kind of ran the show in the Mesozoic when it was a lot warmer than it is today. And so they sort of have this higher set point temperature than we do. So that's the only kind of thing I can think of where CO2 is a direct impact on their physiology.
Yeah, you kind of preempted the question that came to mind there, which was, are there any examples of very radical evolutionary adaptation to carbon dioxide, where clearly the organism, where they're usually not able to adapt fast enough, they actually have, and they have some strange sort of system of their metabolism or some sort of feature of their physiology that is remarkably well adapted to higher carbon dioxide or higher heat? But birds, I guess, is one example of that.
Yeah. And because CO2, so I talked about this earlier process that might have led to life on Earth at the vents at the bottom of the ocean. But obviously, the majority of the biosphere today feeds off of this magic trick of photosynthesis, where plants take in CO2 and using sunlight turn it into what in the book I call the stuff of life, this organic matter that the rest of us then feed off of and dissipate that energy and release it as CO2 and heat and power our lives. But because it's so important that all life is based on it, there have been all sorts of incredible adaptations to acquiring CO2 among like plants and photosynthesizing microbes and stuff. So you have bacteria that has these incredible carbon concentrating machines that when CO2 is low, they get really good at concentrating it. When CO2 declined over the age of mammals, you get this entirely new form of photosynthesis is evolved in a bunch of different lineages of plants that makes them better adapted to lower CO2, drier, and more seasonal environments. So because this stuff is at the center of the whole story, yeah, life sort of moves around it and it then adapts itself to acquiring it in more efficient ways and dealing with its effects in the environment. So
Really cool. Very, really cool. How you've drawn like parallels, and I think sort of one of the overarching themes of this conversation will be like, what can we learn from these extinctions and the history of carbon dioxide, and how does it apply to the world today? Is it comparable when you make a claim like these uber mega volcanoes, shot out as much lava to cover the entire United States 1 kilometer down?
yeah.
It seems like we're maybe in different orders of magnitude than the sort of carbon dioxide that we're outputting today. Talk about like, are they comparable? Like, how do the levels compare? Like, how much lesson can we really draw, or is it just a completely different world?
Yeah, so I go back and forth on this because in some ways those mass extinctions were really extreme, and happened on different worlds. And so we look for these analogs in the fossil record, but none of them are perfect. And that is actually what worries me, is that in some ways this really is a no analog situation, what we're doing today, because we're never going to release as much CO2 as those volcanoes did. We're probably not going to make it 10 degrees C. That seems like just a nightmare scenario. But for some things, to our best estimation, those volcanoes were going off for tens of thousands of years. So we're probably putting CO2, even though we're not going to put as much in, we're probably putting it into the atmosphere about 10 times faster than those mega volcanoes. And for some things, it is the rate that actually is more important. So, well, we're not going to make it 10 degrees C, I don't think, warmer. Acidification is actually completely dependent on, ocean acidification is completely dependent on the rate of CO2 emissions. And so we are doing the equivalent of what those volcanoes would have done over, hundreds to thousands of years in a matter of a century. And we don't really know what the effects of ocean acidification are going to be. They're probably not going to be great. And given the stresses that things like coral reefs already have from warming and coastal pollution and stuff, changing the pH of the entire ocean in a matter of decades is really kind of an incredible shock to give the planet. So those things worry me. And the fact that even though we do study these ancient events, the fact that there isn't really a good analog to how fast we're doing, that does keep me up at night. And I think it's the sort of unknowns. Like I've poured through the fossil record trying to figure out, okay, what is actually the best analogy? And you have events where volcanoes put thousands and thousands of gigatons over tens of thousands of years. And maybe that's too slow to be relevant to what we're doing. But then the only thing that is even remotely on the same pace of what we're doing is there's one estimate that when the asteroid hit Mexico and wiped out the dinosaurs, it vaporized this like basically a Bahamas worth of limestone and injected something like 400 gigatons of CO2 into the air all at once, which is like the equivalent of 10 years of our emissions. And so like that's the only thing. There was a lot of other stuff going on at the time too. So that's not really even relevant either. So there really isn't anything in the fossil record that is quite like us. So we're really jumping into the unknown, and that's the stuff that is worrying.
Sure. What do we know? What does the best science say will happen if we keep increasing the carbon dioxide parts per million concentration in the atmosphere at the same rate or even a higher rate than we're doing now? But let's assume like the same rate. What do we know will happen to the environment?
We know that coral reefs are going to have a very difficult time making it out of this century. We know that over the next few centuries to millennia, sea level is going to go up by a lot, by many meters. Probably even if we stop tomorrow, it seems like there's some things that are kind of been set in motion. I mean, there's, depending on how much further we push it, then you can start to get some pretty strange things on the planet. Like I'm sure you've heard about this thing, in the North Atlantic, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, this thing that delivers heat to Europe, basically, this ocean current that delivers heat. Greenland is melting so fast, there's so much fresh water coming into the system that it could shut down that circulation and make Europe incredibly cold in a matter. People are already worried this might happen by the end of the century. That's still very much debated.
Right. I'm Irish, so I think
yeah.
it's Ireland. I think it's Ireland that gets majorly fucked by that.
Yeah. And this time around, you won't have any Irish elk to hunt like last ice age, so it won't be as fun. Yeah, I mean, then you can get rainforests die back, so like the Amazon could go, and those are kind of the known knowns if you keep pushing on it. But then, we're pushing on this thing, the carbon cycle, which I've sort of skirted around, but it is sort of this grand movement of carbon around the planet that makes Earth, in ways that we just don't know what the impacts will be. And in the book, I interview this guy, Daniel Rothman at MIT, who's this geophysicist who his stuff was really scary. Because he thinks you can put enough CO2 into the system that then you do sort of go into this failure mode where things just kind of go out of control for a few tens of millennia before the planet gets its equilibrium again. And he does see a route to getting to like that end Permian world just from feedbacks in the Earth system. That would be thousands of years from now. We won't be alive to see that, but it is kind of scary and kind of awe-inspiring in a bad way that we are capable of possibly setting off these tripwires in the Earth system that could make things a lot worse.
Yeah. What about the arguments that you sometimes hear that carbon dioxide is greening the planet? That we are greener now than we were in the 1980s, and some people are saying that carbon dioxide is great. Is the planet greening due to carbon dioxide? Is there also benefits to releasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Yeah, there are these talking points that you'll hear from, to put it charitably, I'll call them climate skeptics, but that are true on their face, but have been taken from their context. So they're actually irrelevant to what we're facing. So one of them is this truth that CO2 is, you'll hear CO2 is plant food, and obviously it is, because the whole biosphere is made out of CO2. And starting with plants photosynthesizing and taking CO2 in. And it's true that actually, I think in the book I quote some stat that photosynthesis has actually increased by like 8 to 12% or something since some year, I forget. I'd have to go back to that stat. But so you do have this greening effect. We are, as a energetic, large, complex industrial civilization, we're not interested in just like the general percentage of photosynthesis increase. We're worried about things like staple agricultural crops, and for some of those, the projections are grim going forward, because the planet as a whole might be getting very marginally greener. The weather's also getting more erratic. Droughts are getting longer and deeper. Storms are getting more intense, and so all these things that we rely on for our society are those metrics are all getting worse. And it's not all plants respond to higher CO2 the same. As I said, there's a couple different forms of photosynthesis, and plants that are evolved before and stayed with this way of photosynthesizing from a higher CO2 planet from tens of millions of years ago are disproportionately represented among agricultural weeds. So some agricultural weeds are going to do really well when CO2 gets higher, more so than the crops that we're depending on. So there's all these interplaying and countervailing effects of CO2, that it's not as simple as just saying CO2 makes plants happy, which is, kind of true in a very, trivial way.
No, for sure. There's just so much going on, and likely some pros and cons, but just the emergent stuff that could come out of it is completely unguessable. And
yeah.
What was I going to say? What do you think are the main things that we can do about it? What are the major solutions that have been put forward that you see making a difference here?
This is always what I struggle with, because I come to this stuff because I'm fascinated by planetary science and I'm interested in how the world works. And then people will say, okay, what do we do about it? And I kind of throw up my hands.
All on you, Peter. You should have come up with this already. You should have solved this.
Yeah. I know where we should be focusing our attention. And there's some, we know that we have to just stop emitting it as much as, we have to stop emitting it we have to decarbonize, basically. I think sometimes you'll see flashy headlines about, oh, someone has some promising way of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there are a lot of brilliant people working on, carbon capture techniques and things like that. But I think what isn't emphasized enough is that just from like basic physics, thermodynamics, we know that they'll never be able to scale to an extent that you're going to be able to take it out of the atmosphere at the same rate that we're putting it in. Not even close. And it's because what I was talking about before, it's a very diffuse gas. There's not very much of it in the atmosphere. And, just second law of thermodynamics, taking a very diffuse thing and capturing it and putting it all in one place, like you'd be doing with carbon capture, is a very energetic process. So pretty quickly, when you look at these carbon capture techniques, they run into, energetic constraints, and we're going to need a lot more energy in the future for all sorts of stuff. And it doesn't make a ton of sense if we're investing a lot in super energetic stuff that sweep this diffuse gas out of the atmosphere, rather than investing our energy in how can we power our world without putting it into the atmosphere in the first place. That's really where the rubber meets the road on this stuff. So
Yeah.
it's good that people are working on that, because there's going to be parts of our economy that are going to be very difficult to decarbonize. So once we've gotten our emissions very low and there's still some parts that are tough to totally get rid of, then those technologies will become relevant. But until we decarbonize, they're kind of sideshows.
Right. What's the actual mechanism in there being more atmospheric carbon dioxide and more volatile, like storms and floods and weather conditions? So I think this is something that everyone can see at the moment. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I was in Ireland and it got its worst floods in a very long time. I think it's rained every single day in the UK.
Oh my God.
You're seeing all these statistics come out that it definitely seems like there's more volatile conditions. But do we know exactly why environmental carbon is causing that?
Yeah, so there's this very simple, this is like 19th century like physics, which is there's this relationship between, so for every degree C that a gas gets warmer, it can hold 7% more water vapor. So we're just evaporating. There's just more energy. We're trapping more energy from the sun. There's just more energy in the system. And the air, we were both evaporating and precipitating, much more vigorously. And for every degree C you go up, you just increase that ability of the planet to store water vapor, to power more powerful storms. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just a pretty basic relationship between these two things.
Yeah.
Which is why you see things in like the super high CO2 crazy climate events in Earth's past. Like it seems like it gets a lot stormier. You have evidence in the fossil record for like mega floods and stuff, right at these warming events, which we're seeing today when we see, cars getting swept down the street and things. You see relatively similar things from 56 million years ago. Only there's no cars. You just get big boulders and things being carried in these flood deposits.
Right. I think where I've always struggled a little bit with this is I think as the Western, wealthy countries should absolutely do more to reduce their carbon emissions. I find it very hard to, tell, New Delhi to reduce their emissions, right? When people are under, metal rafters and try to just make sure that they can make ends meet for lunch and dinner and trying to feed their kids, it's like, they, I think rightfully so, do not give a shit about the carbon in the atmosphere. And it's like very hard to convince anyone that they should, in a way. Do we know what level of emissions are, committed by different Western superpowers versus the other countries in the world? Do we have a known breakdown of this?
Well, historically, this has been a story of, Western European and American and Russian, and to a lesser extent in the 20th century, Saudi Arabia, like Middle Eastern emissions. So obviously we have a huge historical burden because, we started a lot of the problem. Is a big burden on us to decarbonize. But today, we've, us here in the West, we've been kind of completely eclipsed by China. And China is both running away with the clean energy transition, development, having all these breakthroughs and deployment of EVs and solar panels and stuff. But they're also they're emitting 4 times more they're burning 4 times more coal right now than the US ever did, even at its peak in the 20th century. So their
I didn't
carbon
know that.
emission,
Interesting stats, yeah.
yeah, their carbon emissions are completely unprecedented. And right behind them is India. The encouraging thing is, rather than spending a century and a half in this fossil fueled economy, it seems like their transitions are starting to take off, and so they'll spend less time in this window of continuing to pollute. It doesn't seem like it's going to be fast enough for some of the more ambitious climate targets, like 1.5 degrees C, I think was in the Paris Agreement in 2016. That was sort of the ambition, was like to limit and potentially keep below warming below 1.5 degrees C. And it seems like we're going to soar that past that in like the next few years. And so then the next one is like 2 degrees C, and it just seems like we're off course for that as well. So right now, it looks like we're going towards more than 3 degrees C in a century, despite sort of the heroic efforts to decarbonize among places like China, which obviously has all sorts of, China has its own problems that we don't have to get into here, but at least in the deployment and development of this technology, they've been sort of leading. And so it's still, I think that just sort of shows you that this thing is this transition, this energy transition is not just on rails. The free market isn't just going to like bring us on this glide path to the climate world that we are hoping to reach, and that there still is, we need to intervene and more than we're already doing to get things to a good place, because like a little over 3 degrees C warming doesn't sound like a lot, but in a century or so, you basically do not see that in all of geological history, except for the really chaotic times when everything's going out of control. So I know it doesn't sound like much, but it really is a lot. So I mean, for context, I think you'll sometimes hear historians talk about the Little Ice Age in Europe and how traumatic that was, which it was locally. It was sort of a regional climate phenomenon, but that was less than a half a degree for the world of climate change. And that had all these crazy geopolitical effects, like people have connected the fall of the Ming Dynasty and the 30 Years' War and all these horrible things to the Little Ice Age. And that was like a tiny little climate shift. And we are pushing the planet, several degrees, the whole planet, several degrees in a matter of centuries into this climate state that the planet has not seen since before the evolution of Homo sapiens. So it's still not a great path that we're on, and it's going to take a little more of a shove to get us on the right one.
What does the model currently say in terms of 3 Cs? So do we have you say a couple of centuries? Is there? I know the error bars are pretty big on these climate models, but like, what is the current estimation if we keep going? When will that 3 degree difference occur?
Oh, by like 2100.
2100.
Yeah.
Right.
So right now we're on pace for like more than 3 by 2100, which doesn't tell you what it's going to be like in 2200 or 2300. And these are still very short timescales. Like,
yeah,
like if the ancient Greeks had done this, had an industrial revolution thousands of years ago, we would still be living in some bizarre climate that they had made. So these are going to be very long. The rest of humanity is going to have to like deal with what we do in this century, which also is kind of inspiring, that like, or not inspiring, but if you want to frame it in a more positive way, like exciting, that the next few decades are really going to, how well or poorly we manage this transition will have effects for thousands of years, if not, extinction wise, millions of years. So these are really important, consequential decades to be alive, that if we comport ourselves well, maybe our ancestors will, or our whatever, our descendants will look back fondly on us. And if we screwed up, then, maybe we'll be the most cursed generation ever. So.
Really well said. Really well said. If you were in charge of these efforts, you had unlimited budget. You've already said that sort of carbon sequestration is limited in its abilities. Where would you be putting funding? Where would you be putting innovation under that lens of like, we can't just halt economic activity, especially in third world countries that are breaking out of poverty? Like, where would you have development? Where would you build infrastructure? Where do you think moves the needle the most, so that in 2100, when my children and grandchildren are walking around, it's, not 3 degrees warmer, it's only 1.5 or 1, or
I don't know. Again, this is like the policy stuff that I'm bad at. But yeah, I mean, we have the technology. I don't know how you allocate it, but invest in the stuff that we know works now, and like solar panels and battery infrastructure, battery technology, I think is going to be the most important thing. Just because, again, like one of the things that people who are against renewables will say is that they're intermittent and the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And that's 100% true. And they have a point. And there's all these sorts of weird effects that solar power can have on electricity markets. That's not ideal. But if you can just store it effectively in giant batteries and deploy it when you need it, then that sort of solves that problem. And so that's a big problem today. Another one is just sort of, a lot of these are not scientific questions or technological questions. And for a long time, I didn't want to sort of wade into the human world because it's messy and it's, political and stuff. But at this point, these are political questions. And in my country, we know what we need to do if we want to decarbonize. We need to like double the size of the electric grid, which would be costlier than the interstate highway system by a lot. And that's not going to happen without a massive, getting everyone on board and a massive political movement in that direction. And so,
right,
it's this. If you want to know, the reason why I can't avoid this stuff anymore is because, like, if you want to know planetary science questions, like what is the pH of the ocean going to be, or what is the what is the sea level going to be in 2100? You have to understand what are these human systems going to do that mediate this stuff, which seems, that's obvious, but yeah, my expertise very quickly, runs out when it comes to this stuff, because I don't know how we're going to pull off that large, incredible infrastructure project. And that's just one part of the transition.
right. Especially because basically the entire focus of the world right now seems to be building data centers and larger AI.
Yes.
Which is also going to, probably have a pretty demonstrably bad effect on climate unless the LLM can give us a solution. But have you thought about this? This current creation of data centers and AI and just scaling these up as fast as possible, what effect that's going to have on the environment and climate? That's a common argument that you hear today as well.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it's another one of these questions about, we have this potentially transformative technology, but how we deploy it is going to be, a question for human societies. Should it be left in the control of, people whose only motivation is firing all the paralegals in the world and making, horrible cat videos and keeping you addicted to your phone? Or should there be some more democratic control over how we could potentially deploy this technology to make our lives better, make our societies better? And so I think there's some real transformative potential. The energy questions behind it, I think, unless they really come up with some miraculous stuff in the next year or so, which, there's grumbling, some people in that world think that is on the verge of happening, you just can't, whether it's biology or economics, you can't have a unbelievably expensive energy burning thing go on forever if it doesn't prove its worth. And so I think it's sort of the most apocalyptic scenarios for energy use and carbon emissions from these things. I think I discount those because I think there's going to be some sort of market correction where these are not, at least in the short term, like the internet, where people in the 80s were talking about how this is about to change everything. It took a long time for that fuse to run out. And I think a similar thing might be true for AI, where in the short term there might be some economic pain, hopefully, for some of these Silicon Valley people. Sorry, I'm sure you have connections there, but in the long term,
actually.
Yeah, okay. But in the long term, I think it will, like, potentially this is just another tool in our species toolbox, which our whole history has been about deploying tools for better and better, more sophisticated tools for our advantage. So
yeah, Peter, this has been so much fun. Long meandering conversation through 4 billion years. I'm sure the listener will have a much greater appreciation for carbon dioxide. Your books are actually genuinely amazing. I've read about half of both of them, I will admit. but I will link them down below. I think everyone should pick them up. You're a really good writer, and thank you so much for the conversation. I really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks so much, Evan.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free